5 on 4, Josephine McDermott discovers the lost sounds of international radio.
When you listen to the radio, do you ever think of it as a tool of soft power? Last year, when the bulk of funding was removed from the United States broadcaster Voice of America, there was a lot of talk about soft power. The service had been seen as a vital way to communicate a message of democracy and freedom to the rest of the world. But radio frequencies across the globe stopped carrying its broadcasts, newsrooms closed, and staff sent home. The president signed an executive order to strip it back, accusing it of being anti-Trump and having a left-wing bias. A White House statement said the order would ensure taxpayers are no longer on the hook for radical propaganda. One critic called the decision soft power suicide. Soft power, that subtle act of persuasion, can be dated back to when sounds first started to travel across continents 100 years ago. Nations, for the first time, could quickly and effectively try to make people beyond their borders see the world through their eyes using radio. But with the internet and social media revolutions, and funding priorities changing in the West, the Voice of America wasn't the first Western broadcaster to go quiet on shortwave radio. The soft power war of the airwaves has now moved to a decisive phase. Is international radio still needed? And if it isn't, what has been lost? Will there be a void? And who will fill it? I'm Josephine McDermott, and I make programmes for the BBC World Service. I also love delving into audio history and bringing to light the bits you might have missed. And in this case, it includes some astonishing sounds from around the world. We'll meet the people who established that soft power tool, international radio. The people who listened to it, produced it, and devoted their lives to it, focusing particularly on how it has been used in the ideological battle between East and West. As we reflect on the peak of radio's global influence in the 1970s and 80s, we'll revel in that on-air League of Nations from Radio Austria International.
Österreichische Rundfunk, Wien. Austria calling from Vienna.
To Radio Tashkent in Uzbekistan.
Radio Tashkent calling.
And the sounds lost to time. We'll shine a light on the Netherlands' feel-good messaging to the world.
This is the Happy Station Show, your Sunday family show of miles across the mile.
And we'll dip into Moscow mailbag for some Soviet seduction.
Well, who's our first letter from today, Edward?
An old friend of yours, Doris, Brian Hartley of Thornton-le-Field, asking what...
We'll uncover some of the surprising ways that cultures have crossed.
4 of the Russians joined the Archers cast to improve their skills. They'd been taught from scratch in Moscow by a former Archers editor.
Yes, a Russian version of the Archers in 1994, and the utterly unique experience of a broadcaster born in New Zealand who came to become the global voice of the Albanian Stalinist regime.
You just didn't do research because another side of the story would come out, and the truth would come out, and then where would you be?
After 100 years, has radio as a means of soft power now run its course? If we're going to find out if the world needs radio for soft power, let's find out what it is. Professor Joseph Nye held top jobs at Harvard University and in the US government, particularly under Democrat administrations. He coined the term soft power, believing America's global influence was built on more than its military might.
Power is the ability to get what you want from others, and you can do it 3 ways. You can do it with coercion, you can do it with payment, or you can do it with attraction, persuasion. Coercion and payment I call hard power. The ability to get what you want through attraction and persuasion is soft power.
That can be everything from student exchanges to trade deals and feature films. But how did radio come to be used for attraction and persuasion? First, I'm taking you back right to the start and how radio went from apparently disconnected sounds to rousing entertainment featuring the biggest stars of the day. Radio begins with experiments in the early 1900s, building on the wireless transmissions of Guglielmo Marconi. They sent dots and dashes of Morse code, spark-generated pulses that were effectively a kind of cipher and had to be transcribed to make any sense. The people experimenting as a hobby, called amateur operators, were ordered off the air during World War I. But in 1920, the world's first commercial broadcasting station with the call sign KDKA opens in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the United States. It's evolved from weekly experimental broadcasts from the garage of a man called Frank Conrad. One of the many people fascinated by this in the UK is a young man born in Mexico called Peter Eckersley, as he recalled to the BBC in 1957.
I do think that probably the first manifestation of the power of broadcasting was in the United States of America. A delightful man whom I knew very well called Conrad of the Westinghouse Company of Pittsburgh, PA. And he just had one of the wireless transmitters, and he had a microphone. And it occurred to him that on a Saturday night he might give the boys a treat. And he put on a few gramophone records and so on.
I shine, I cry, oh, it's just a bit of heaven when my baby smiles at me.
And everybody, the amateurs, listened and enjoyed the little sounds that are coming out. Because, you know, if you got a wireless set as an amateur which had never done more than go pa 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 pa, and then suddenly you heard a voice or even music, I mean, it was fascinating. And the date? Well, 1919, 1920.
Frank Conrad's little sounds in his so-called air concerts couldn't be heard in Europe, but he was one of the first people to use the term broadcasting outside the original agricultural sense to scatter seeds. He wondered, could it be possible that radio could be used to communicate with more than one person? An audience? At the same time, the Netherlands and Canada were starting stations too, but when it came to getting attention, it was a prima donna opera singer who would give her name to a pudding of poached peaches and a performance in Essex that would really capture the public's imagination. Media historian Professor Jean Seaton in 2012, in Archive on 4, tuning in.
Dame Nellie Melba was the diva of her age. She was known everywhere. She was Australian. She was hugely regarded. The Daily Mail thinks that this new broadcasting lark might be something it can make a fuss about. So it gets Dame Nellie Melba in 1920 to trundle out to Chelmsford and sing. So it's one of those great events in which broadcasting, but like perhaps the televising of the Queen's coronation, it suddenly becomes, we'd say these days, it goes viral. It becomes an event.
She was heard by people as far as 1,500 miles away, across Europe and as far as Iran and Canada. By the end of 1923, the British Broadcasting Company was a year old and able to relay broadcasts from that first commercial station, KDKA, in America, using shortwave. Peter Eckersley, so impressed with sounds that weren't just pa 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 pa, was now the first chief engineer of what would become the British Broadcasting Corporation. Another radio pioneer, Harry P. Davis, the founder of KDKA, later wrote,
"Here occurred an epoch in human history, for man had truly conquered space. A human voice was heard simultaneously in North America and Europe, a greeting to millions of people spanning nature's barriers, with no connecting media except the invisible and the unknown. Probably in all the years of history, no greater feat of science had been recorded."
This epoch has fascinated many, and one enthusiast has dedicated himself to making sure it's not forgotten.
My name's Thomas Witherspoon, and I created this website called the Shortwave Radio Audio Archive. I love archiving things, and I hate to think that sounds are lost over time. In the earliest days of home recording equipment, people started recording what they would hear on the air. So cassette tapes and reel-to-reel tapes and all these other things. And so I decided to kind of take it upon myself just to create this archive.
So what is the invisible feat of science those early pioneers talked about that happens when we hear sounds from a distant country?
Shortwave radio operates in the high frequency or HF band between about 3 and 30 megahertz. Shortwave uses skywave propagation. What happens is when the signal leaves a broadcaster's tower, the signal goes up into the ionosphere and it bounces off of it.
section of the atmosphere which starts at about 53 miles up, above where the Earth's weather happens and above the ozone layer.
The ionosphere, which is this charged layer of the Earth's atmosphere, acts as a mirror that reflects the signal back down. And the really fascinating thing about it is, based on the frequency, the time of day, and using the science that we know as skywave propagation, broadcasters can figure out what frequency to use, at what time of day, and where to target, using the types of antennas that they have, a certain region of the globe. So, for example, here in the States, we could target, say, Western Europe, and the footprint of that broadcast would be vast, much, much bigger than, say, an FM footprint, and possibly much more than a medium wave or AM footprint as well. And it doesn't stop there, though. Sometimes it skips and goes back up to the ionosphere and bounces back down. So maybe a program that was targeted for, say, Western Europe could also be heard in Asia.
With our first broadcast in English of the day, we wish you good reception conditions.
We have these signals that are invisible. We can't see them, of course, and our ears can't hear them, but they're bouncing all over the Earth all the time because the ionosphere, when it's charged, sort of contains them on our globe.
Can you describe the first time you heard shortwave?
I remember my dad had in our living room a 1936 RCA console radio that belonged to my grandfather. And my dad, every Sunday morning, would turn it on, and it was tuned to WWV Fort Collins, Colorado, which is a National Institute, it's an NIST time station. And all it does is it broadcasts the time from an atomic clock. And one of the really fascinating aspects of radio is that it travels at the speed of light. So it is extremely accurate when you're listening to the atomic clock.
At the tone, 20 hours, 48 minutes, Coordinated Universal Time.
It's about the most accurate thing that you can listen to over the air. And my dad would set his watch to that station. Eventually I got brave enough as a little kid to say, can I tune around and see what else I can hear on here? And I would tune and I would hear things like Deutsche Welle, Radio France International,
Don't forget to join us again tomorrow on Radio France International for Paris.
And Radio Moscow, and a whole bunch of other Cold War era stations and broadcasters from across the world. And then when I believe I was about 8 years old, a family member actually gave me a shortwave radio that belonged to their son. And it was a Zenith transoceanic transistor solid state radio. It was really beautiful. And I set it up in my bedroom and I could tune in the world with that. And I kept a logbook and had a map where I would put pins in of the stations that I heard across the globe. I loved Radio Netherlands.
From wherever you might be, you're tuned to Radio Nederland, the Dutch World.
They were the real innovators of the day, and they really did have a lot of shows that were sticky. People loved listening to them, like the Happy Station show.
This is the Happy Station Show, your Sunday family show of miles across the miles. Today we have a visitor who, first of all, is going to treat us to a little song.
I also liked listening to Radio Havana, Cuba, because I really loved the music that was on
it. We'll hear more from Thomas and his amazing archive later, but first let's go back to December 1932 and the start of the BBC's Empire Service, as it was then called, a vital early moment for soft power through broadcasting. The new shortwave radio technology is allowing signals to be broadcast over vast distances, bouncing through the ionosphere, and a few days later, King George V uses it to deliver a Christmas message.
Through one of the marvels of modern science, I am enabled this Christmas Day to speak to all my peoples throughout the empire.
In the Netherlands, companies with commercial interests in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, had also formed a colonial broadcasting organisation.
Hallo dames en heren, hello ladies and gentlemen, this is station PHI of Philips Broadcasting Holland, India.
It was another 6 years before the BBC began broadcasting in languages other than English. It launched an Arabic service in January 1938, quickly followed by Spanish and Portuguese for Latin America. But it was the crisis of September that year, when British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with Adolf Hitler as the continent approached the brink of war, which saw the start of the first European language services. They were now a necessity, as Leonard Mile, broadcaster and BBC manager, recalled in 1985 for the corporation's oral history collection.
BBC broadcasting in German began very suddenly at the time of Munich. It looked as though we were going to war. There were people evacuating children from London, digging trenches, issuing gas masks, and the Prime Minister decided that he'd better broadcast to the British people to tell them why this was all happening. And the Cabinet decided that the broadcast should also be translated into German and fed to Germany. And instructions were given to this effect, which only reached the BBC a matter of hours before Chamberlain started to broadcast. They grabbed people to translate it and announce it and started broadcasting in German that night. And it went on from there onwards, in French, German and Italian.
For the same oral history collection, in 1989, Alan Bullock, who joined the European service in 1940, described how it was vital to counter German propaganda.
There must at some stage have been a decision that what we were going to do is to broadcast news, that this was the philosophy of the European service, and there's a very practical reason for that. Many people who were listening to us were doing so a great danger to themselves. And we had the competitive urge because we had a very powerful German service, the Goebbels propaganda outfit, which during a period when we were inevitably going to be having retreats and defeats and so on, they would be announcing these. If we were to establish our credibility at the very beginning, we had to show we weren't afraid to announce this and to explain it and so on.
Not only was Goebbels' Nazi news outfit announcing British retreats and defeats, but he was using a cast of people who sounded at least as if they should have been allies. Among them would be the American former Broadway showgirl with her blonde pin curls, Mildred Gillers, known as Axis Sally, speaking here in 1943.
This is Berlin calling, and I'd just like to say, girls, that when Berlin calls, it pays to listen.
The American-born, Irish-raised William Joyce, known as Lord Haw-Haw, would become the best-known English-speaking voice of Nazi radio.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling.
Even by this time, England does not seem to have realized that her usual sanctimonious methods no longer fit in with the times in which we live.
The United States joined the war in 1941, and with that, they joined the Battle of the Airwaves. The Romanian-born John Houseman, best known as the actor and producer who worked with the Hollywood star Orson Welles, was interviewed by James Day in 1974 and talked about his time as director of Voice for America, or VOA as it came to be known.
About 5, 6, 7 of us really created the Voice of America. There were no broadcasts of the Voice of America at all when we got there, and within about 7 months there were about 800 a day.
In a special 40th anniversary radio programme in 1982, John Houseman and William Harlan Hale, who was the first voice on Voice of America, recalled the start. The recording is held at the US National Archives and was found with the help of historian Neil Levon.
I worked around the clock, for I had much to learn. I spent hours each day listening to the British and enemy broadcasts. We needed to create shows that would sound straightforward, truthful and clear, bearing in mind that many of our audience might be listening at the risk of their lives.
By a strange irony, it so happened that before the first broadcast, I had an invitation to go to a dinner and a ballet, and I was dressed accordingly for the occasion. I remember in the very first words that I used in the first broadcast that went out from this country, in the German language, I said, "Hier sprechen Stimmen aus Amerika. Aus Amerika im Krieg. Unsere Stimmen kommen zu." In other words, Voices from America. It was only a few months later that we finally were given the official title, The Voice of America.
The show was considered a success. The State Department was silent, but the White House monitored it and congratulated us. So did the British by transatlantic phone. Later, their underground monitoring stations in neutral and enemy territories reported that the Nazis had done their heaviest jamming of the war to prevent this first voice of America from being heard.
Jamming, intentionally disrupting radio communication, would prove the worth of what was being transmitted, but it was letters from listeners in occupied countries that solidified the success.
We were haunted during those first months of the war by the constant fear that the voice of America, no matter how carefully we prepared and transmitted it, would never be heard by those for whom it was intended. Finally, after many weeks, a letter arrived by a circuitous route from Cannes in France. You in America cannot imagine how even a few minutes of news from America, heard by a Frenchman, is spread around. An hour after it is heard, hundreds, thousands know the truth.
This is the voice of America. Ici, New York.
With the war coming to its closing stages, on German radio, an inebriated-sounding Lord Haw made his last broadcast as the Allies arrived in Berlin in 1945.
You have heard something about the Battle of Berlin. I'm going to say that the men who have died have given their lives to show that whatever else happens, Germany will live. Es lebe Deutschland, Heil Hitler, and farewell.
He would be tried for treason and hanged. In August 1945, the news came that the world had been waiting for. The Second World War had ended. This was repeated on a loop in English and Japanese by the Voice of America.
The White House has just announced that the Japanese government has accepted the peace proposal of the Allied governments. Stand by for further details.
日本の皆様、発表を申し上げます。
80 years later at the White House, in March 2025, weeks after being returned to office on a promise to cut taxes, regulation and the size of government, Donald Trump issued an executive order to strip back the US Agency for Global Media. It oversees a number of news outlets including Voice of America, Radio Free Asia and Radio Free Europe. He accused it of left-wing bias, and more than 1,000 VOA employees were put on leave. The electric car billionaire Elon Musk, who was advising the president, wrote this on the social media platform X, voiced by a producer.
Yes, shut them down. 1. Europe is free now. Not counting stifling bureaucracy. Hello? 2. Nobody listens to them anymore. 3. It's just radical left crazy people talking to themselves while torching $1 billion a year of US taxpayer money.
Like other big international media organisations that started on shortwave, such as the BBC, Deutsche Welle and France Média Monde, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia have become much more, using other frequencies and also TV, websites, social media and partner stations to publish their content. In 2024, the US Agency for Global Media reported reaching an audience of more than 420 million people weekly in 64 languages. It requested $944 million from the US government to run it that year, pointing out that Russia and China were investing in media markets including Indonesia, Pakistan, Africa and Latin America. This was the sound as Voice of America went off the air in Africa a year later, recorded by a UK listener, Mark Hurst. Jamie Shea, formerly a NATO spokesperson, was among those critical of the decision.
I used the term soft power suicide. There was no overwhelming financial crisis in the US government that would have necessitated closing down these public broadcasting services. The second thing is that there was no alternative in terms of private sector media in the United States. willing to pick up that mantle. Today, we are now in a much more competitive environment where China is learning soft power. Even Russia, despite its poor image, has a go at it with Sputnik, with RT, China with CGTN, the Chinese Global Public Network. And these countries are putting large sums of money into this, as are Gulf states, as is Turkey with TRT International broadcasting. So this is not the time for the United States to abandon the field to these state broadcasters.
Thomas Witherspoon, the shortwave enthusiast we heard from earlier, is certainly not abandoning the field. He's carefully collecting and cataloguing all the audio sent to him from radio's international past, because to him, the sounds he hears make him feel connected to the world in ways beyond the obvious. It goes much deeper than pushing narratives.
I enjoy so much about the medium that goes above and beyond just its ability to carry information. I love the sound of shortwave radio. I love the sonic texture of shortwave radio.
Coming to you from Seoul, the capital of the Republic of Korea. And now we begin our 30-minute transmission.
Not perfect. It is not CD quality. You hear hiss, you hear background noise.
20 hours and 2 minutes GMT on the international service of Radio Algiers. Here is the news.
When you're tuned off of a station, you're hearing the remnants of our solar system and the Big Bang. For a long time, I just leave the radio on in the house, tuned to a station or waiting for a station to happen. Just let it play in the background, and you just hear the static, HF static, when you're doing that. And I find it really soothing.
And you could